How about a hand for that film? So that film was brought to us today by the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula, which is collaborating with the Missoula League of Women Voters in a three-part series entitled Abridging Rights of the Other: Human Repercussions of Confiscation, Separation, and Confinement. My name is Teresa Jacobs, and I've organized this series on behalf of the League of Women Voters, a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization here in Missoula. 75 years ago, during World War II, as we just heard, 120,000 innocent people of Japanese ancestry were forced to leave homes, communities, and livelihoods to live for years behind fences and barbed wire, without due process, and even though most of them were U.S. citizens. In our three-part series that starts today, we'll be examining the repercussions of that shameful period. The series is being made possible in part by an opportunity grant from Humanities Montana, which is an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So in our second half of the program here, we're going to be turning to our speakers, Diane Sands and Bob Knight, who will speak briefly today about the experience of confinement from the perspective of those who were confined here in Missoula at Fort Missoula. This program is being videotaped by MCAT as a part of Media Assistant Grant Program for nonprofit organizations. And if we have time at the end, we'll take a few questions. So before we start, I want to tell you a little bit about Diane Sands and Bob Knight. Among the many positions Diane Sands has had, she was the development director at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula for many years when many of these remnants of World War II were preserved with her activities. In 2013, Diane received a Historic Preservation Excellence Award recognizing her outstanding efforts at the Historical Museum to preserve and interpret the Alien Detention Center and to produce the 2015 video that we just saw, documentary. She recently received a Heritage Guardian Award from the Montana Historical Society for her work. Bob Knight worked as a lawyer here in Missoula for 37 years before retiring. His lifelong interest in constitutional issues and Western history in general was sparked during his years as a Boy Scout back in the 1960s in Colorado. He got to know Minoru Yasuri, a prominent lawyer and Japanese-American activist whose father, Masuo Yasuri, who was in the video, was arrested and interned at Fort Missoula in 1941. Minoru, the son, traveled to Missoula in 1942 hoping to legally represent his father at his enemy alien detention hearing, but was not allowed to. So without further ado, Diane.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. This is great to see a turnout for this. It's been shown a few times and it runs periodically on PBS if you want to see it again. First of all, I should thank the Historical Museum for its support for this film, but also the funding for this came from the National Park Service. They have a Japanese containment historical grant program that we have used twice at the museum, once to restore the courtroom and another time to produce this film and redo exhibits at the museum and do some other work that gets this story out there. And secondly, the Greater Montana Foundation also helped fund this project, so thanks to all of them. I'm a historian, primarily oral historian, women's historian, Montana historian, not a military historian. Didn't know anything about this story until I was working at Fort Missoula and looking to buy this building and restore it, and in that context started to find out something about the layout of the building as it had changed over the years, and in the process of that then uncovered the story of this particular courtroom and was able to restore it. And that of course led to a passion about this entire topic of the internment history. In addition to that, as a legislator, I serve in the Senate. I am constantly aware of the issue of the legal rights of people whose status may not be as protected as some of us have, whether you're a gay person, whether you were an Arab American after 9/11, whatever it is. Even though our Constitution claims to protect all of us and grant us all equal rights, that's not always the case. It's historically an issue where people have to fight for that and continue to fight for that. I was honored before I started working on this film, when I was working on this project, to be at a gathering, they call them pilgrimages, where all of the people who were held in the relocation camps, not particularly this one, families come together. And so in Denver there were like 2,000 descendants and Japanese who had been held in any of the other camps, the 12 other camps. And at that event, people didn't know anything about this, so I did a small presentation and people were startled by it. But at that conference, a woman got up who's the head of the Arab American Association, and she thanked the Japanese and said, if it were, this was right after 9/11, if it were not for the Japanese Americans who had gone through this history and this experience, standing up in Congress and other places where there were a number of people, including Senator Inouye, who'd been sent to one of these camps, standing up and reminding people of this history and of the rights that are involved when we get into these stressful historical moments where we're likely to just say, yeah, we're scared of them all, we don't know who's good, we don't know who's bad, to quote Donald Trump, let's just all lock them up. And because the people who had been through this experience as Japanese Americans stood up and again reminded people of this history, which we're hearing some of lately in response to Donald Trump's immigration issues, we did not lock up the entire Arab American community in the United States. And there was quite a bit of discussion at the policy and political level about the need perhaps to do that. So I think this history is fundamentally important for all of us to understand. It's particularly an interesting history to talk about with different populations. At the museum, we do get people who are descendants of this history who have come and want to see something of the history of their father or grandfather. But we also get groups of school kids, which the museum has made a real commitment to making sure they understand something of this history. And I'm always been particularly interested when we have groups of Native American kids who come down and look at the comparison of this history with their own history. When Ronald Reagan was president, the Congress and the president actually issued an official apology for the internment of Japanese Americans. We've never done that for Native Americans or paid reparations, which we did in a minor way for Japanese Americans. So there are lots of legal and constitutional issues in here. You hear the words Alien Detention Act, which is still in place, which gives our country and other countries the authority to literally take and lock up people who are not citizens of this country. They do not have the same rights. You don't have to go through all the same procedures and legal protections that American citizens have. That law still is in place and it is still used in many situations, and all you have to do is think about our whole history after 9/11 to understand that. We also hear a lot of reference in here to the Geneva Convention, which is was so fundamentally important and is recorded repeatedly in the records of the internment camp. And the example that's not in here, but I would mention to you, is there was one situation when one of the Japanese men was being interrogated by some of the border guards, where they actually pushed him and touched him. They didn't beat him up, but they did touch him and abuse him. That, within a day, those people, the guards, were put on notice, fired, moved, and there's an official letter in the record from the commandant of the camp saying that it will not be tolerated here. This, because of the Geneva Convention and because of their concern of how Americans were being treated overseas. So the protections of the Geneva Convention were the paramount legal framework for the alien detention camp. Very few of these, a handful of them, a few of them are actually citizens of the United States. Most of them aren't, including we have couple hundred people who have been brought here and kidnapped by the government who are from Central and South America, who really are in no man's land here. But the Geneva Convention is the predominant legal structure here, and I think Bob's going to talk a little bit about the constitutional issues for those who were Americans and how those interplay with this issue of the Geneva Convention for these citizens. I'm glad to answer any questions. I wrote it, directed, found the money for it, etc. So I'm always glad to talk about that. But is that related to this, or should I have Bob talk first?
I have a question.
Okay.
Who were these interrogators, judges who sat in that courtroom? And
Okay, here's how that process worked. So the FBI, you heard about J. Edgar Hoover, already had files on all of these guys. Those files were sent to Missoula for the interrogation purpose. So already they had filled out long forms, the Japanese themselves, the FBI had its investigative file, etc. Those go to this hearing board, which is comprised supposedly of some maybe a county attorney from the county the person was from. Well, that didn't last very long because they hold all these hearings, or most of them are held within 6 months, so there will be several even in a day. And because of the travel and everything else, there usually isn't much of a presence from their hometown. So these boards are comprised of citizens, outstanding male citizens from the community. The most famous one here is Mike Mansfield. And Mike Mansfield, because he was at that point teaching at the university and taught Asian history, was the only person who knew anything about it. So he was on a few of these. Lee Part, who was head of the law school, was on it, and a couple of the business community and those folks. Now, Mike has been asked repeatedly about this, and as you all, anyone who knew him, he remembered everything about everybody he had ever met. He had a detailed memory. He continued to say, I don't remember anything about it. But none of those, so that board would then look at the material, the person would come in, they had a list of questions that they asked them. They were not, because of the Alien Detention Act, not entitled to a lawyer, etc. They went through that series of questioning, and then the board would write up its recommendation to the FBI, back to the FBI, and not in a single case did they ever say they considered the person to be a threat. But as you know, that didn't mean they got released in any way, shape, or form. And in the WWII case, even when that file goes forward to the FBI, Hoover writes on it. He writes, when the request is to release WWII to go be with his family, he writes, his son is an arrogant and dangerous man, and I will never release him. And there's a pleading letter we have from his wife saying, can he join me? And Hoover writes, never, on that file. So, and we'll get into that story more, but so that's how those are conducted. The interrogation officers are the Border Patrol, and John Moe, who was later sheriff, is one of those. Because some of the Japanese speak American, many of them are English, many of them do, but some only speak Japanese. The interpreters are Korean. And if you know anything about the history of the Koreans and the Japanese, they were not trusted by the Japanese attorneys, nor should they have been. So there's a lot of tension around that issue as well, because there really isn't a Japanese community here that could have provided interpretation. Does that answer what you want to know? Anybody else? And there are transcripts. We have transcripts of many of those verbatim as much as possible. The woman who took the shorthand for that produced those transcripts. We'll have other questions, but why don't I turn it over to Bob, and perhaps it'll spur more questions on your behalf. Yeah, go ahead.
Diane, were there ever reparations to the Japanese citizens of the country who were constitutional rights violated?
Yeah, and Bob will talk about that, but to the ones who were held at the war relocation camps, not these men who are not citizens of the United States, no. Let me mic it up here.
So before you leave, Diane, I have a question.
Okay.
Why do you believe, what do you believe made it possible for this large-scale incarceration of innocent people to occur, and could it happen again? Bob, you can answer that later too.
Well, I think I did, in fact. I mean, it can happen again and has repeatedly been tried to happen since then. But we're not the only country that did this. I will also say I spent a great deal of time, and I visited most of the camps in Canada where anyone of Japanese descent on the West Coast was also moved to the interior. And if you go up into British Columbia, like to Nelson and some of those areas up in there, those camps have been preserved. And as I said, the United States, in collaboration with most of the governments of Central and South America, also went down there and literally, they call it kidnapped the prominent Japanese citizens, brought them eventually to the United States, and we have a couple of hundred of them at Fort Missoula that we don't know as much about as we would like to know. And many of them were refused the right to ever even return to their country. So they were left in kind of a no man's land, as some of these gentlemen were, because they were asked questions in the hearings about their loyalty to the United States and their loyalty to Japan, where they had business relationships, family, etc. But because of the Asian Exclusion Acts, they were not allowed to become citizens of the United States. So they're kind of caught in a a legal constitutional predicament that they are not citizens of this country because they're not allowed to become citizens. Some of them choose to be repatriated to Japan, but not very many. But they really are caught in a legal constitutional issue, which this gentleman is far more versed in talking to you about those legal issues. That answer your question? And racism, because I mean the Exclusion Acts that lay behind all of this go back to the 1880s and 90s, particularly when the Japanese and the Chinese are here working in the mines, building railroad, et cetera, and are an economic threat to the emerging AFL-CIO. And so there's a great deal of overt racism and violence toward those communities. It's called the Great Driving Out, and there's various pieces of legislation that they can't own property, this, that, and the other thing, can't bring in family members and that sort of stuff. And a lot of that's in the Northwest. I mean, there's hanging of some people, burning, literally burning down their communities, et cetera. So that's what underlies the history of exclusion and they're not being able to be citizens. All yours.
Okay. Do I need any more than that?
There.
Do I need the other part?
Oh, yeah, well,
Okay.
or I could stand with you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. I join in thanking the Historical Museum and also the League of Women Voters in sponsoring this event. This is a very complex topic, something one can hardly scratch the surface on in half an hour, probably several hours. I don't want to repeat anything from the movie if possible, or what Diane has had to say. It's an extraordinary piece of work, and Diane is largely responsible for the DVD. And you also saw Carol von Valkenburg on that program, and her book, An Alien Place, is still available. And if you want to pursue this matter further, I would heartily recommend that you acquire a copy. It gets into more detail in the circumstances that confronted both the Italians and the Japanese. As noted, I'm a latecomer to this issue in terms of actually digging into some degree on the research. I attended a program probably about 3 years ago now at the fort at the recently restored hearing room, and that evening it all kind of came together. I did get to know Missoula in 1962, February of 1962. I was a Boy Scout and joined a contingent of young men from Denver who went to the first Asian Boy Scout Jamboree in Gotemba, Japan that summer. And Min was a prominent attorney, prominent in Japanese American issues. Denver had a sister city, Takayama, Japan, and they were very much involved. And he was our overall advisor and leader for this group. And he was a dynamic, exceptional person. You saw him talking about his presence at his father's hearing when his father was accused of being a disloyal citizen and having to witness the kind of interrogation that went on regarding documents pertaining to the Panama Canal and the fact that they were asking his father to prove that he was not disloyal to the United States. So seeing that, I thought this is something that has interested me in the past, and so I did dig in and have done some research regarding the topic. And part of what I have focused on is to try to find more about some of the lives of the men before, during, and after their internment. I think that the Italian situation is much different from my perspective than the Japanese that were here. You know, they were seamen, they were people that worked on Italian ships. They were picked up under the dragnet of the Alien Act, but most of them, by all appearances, albeit they were deprived of family and contact, had a pretty good time at Fort Missoula, and they weren't charged with any crime. They didn't go through any hearing to establish any kind of loyalty. They weren't expected to. They were Italian citizens, and they were there in some respects. They was thought to be there for their own protection, and I think a number of them felt that they were in fact protected from at least having to be conscripted and serve in the Italian army. The Japanese situation in this particular location is very, very different. These were older men, as noted. They were the prominent people in their communities. For Missoula, it was West Coast communities, Washington, Oregon, California. Simultaneously, there was an imprisonment of arrest of over 1,400 Japanese in similar circumstances in Hawaii. They were imprisoned at Fort Sand, something like that. I'm sorry, it's escaped me right now. But anyway, they went through the same kind of process that went on here. These men were legal aliens. They were legally in the United States. And many of them had been for a long period of time. As noted, Masao Yasui came here at the turn of the century, or 1903 or thereabouts. He was not, that was not unusual. And it's important to bear in mind that he was never permitted to become a United States citizen, notwithstanding his long residence and the establishment of his family. There was a Supreme Court case in the early 1920s brought by a fellow that claimed that he should be afforded U.S. citizenship. He was from Berkeley, California. He was Japanese. The Supreme Court said, no, no, no. He claimed he was Caucasian. You had to be either Caucasian or black in terms of your franchisement as a result of the Civil War to have citizenship. And they said, no, no, no. By Caucasian, we mean white. So there went the opportunity. And in fact, there were Indians and Chinese, and I believe some Japanese, that had actually obtained citizenship that were then reversed in terms of their status. That was followed by action by Congress to prohibit any further immigration of Japanese, and also to prohibit citizenship by any Japanese. And you could be a legal alien, an alien in residence in the United States, if you were here before the act was 1923. I believe it was July 1st of 1924. So these men, many of whom had been here since the late 1800s, early 1900s, were not allowed to become citizens under any circumstance. They were the leaders of their community. They were the doctors, the lawyers, the businessmen, the newspaper editors, the publishers, the ministers, the priests. They were the cream of society and association. They held their community together. They were revered. It was because of that that they were perceived to have the capacity to be a danger to the United States. So starting in Hawaii about 1936, and definitely on the state side 1939, the Office of Navy Intelligence, Army Intelligence, and the FBI started compiling lists of people who might be potentially dangerous in this group. It was largely determined by the nature of their association. If they belonged to Japanese associations or contributed to things that had been part of their military past in Japan, those were big black marks that were made in their file. And this went on for at least 2 years actively stateside, so that come Pearl Harbor, we had definitive orders to arrest these men immediately. Telegrams went to all the FBI offices under J. Edgar Hoover's authority saying, this man, and they were comprehensive lists, these people are to be arrested and retained immediately. And so within hours of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and actually within hours and certainly the next day or the day in the United States, these men were promptly arrested at their homes and placed in INS facilities. They weren't advised of what the charges were against them. They were rounded up, gathered, brought to Fort Missoula, and Diane has described the process that was utilized for these hearing boards. When we talk about, I know you want to focus on constitutional rights, these people were entitled to protection by the Geneva Convention as well, and there's evidence that they were afforded that. Were they entitled to anything else? Well, if you look at it from contemporary constitutional law principles, they probably were. When we look at the key provisions of due process and equal protection, they aren't tied to citizens. They're tied to persons. And if you look at key provisions of protection for people accused of crimes, they're tied to the accused. They're not tied to citizens as well. But any consideration of that went out the window or never was considered. What they did in Fort Missoula for these men, and they thought they were doing them a great favor, the Attorney General established a process which he said was not designed to be a jury trial, but what was intended to give these people the opportunity to prove their innocence. It was very difficult to do because they set forth the procedure that was to be followed. It was initiated, the hearings were initiated after each of these men was required to fill out an enemy alien questionnaire. There were 127 questions, I think, on the questionnaire, and if any of you got one of these things, you would go to about the second question and say, you know, you can't ask me about this. I mean, there were every detail of their lives in detail. Family, banking, business, et cetera, et cetera. They were required to sign these under oath, attesting to the accuracy and truthfulness of what they did. And I want to use the example of a fellow that parallels Missoula, C.J. Okamura. He came to San Francisco in the early 1900s and started a confectionery business. It's still in operation today. He got his questionnaire, he filled it out. Late January 1942, he does the attestation. He's immediately given a notice of hearing February 3rd. The notice of hearing says you can have witnesses, can't have counsel, and he appears at his hearing, and there's no bill of particulars. There's no charges. You're not charged with this, that, or anything. They don't tell them what they're charged with. But they appear before what is to be a three-judge panel whose decision must be unanimous in order for there to be parole or some action other than imprisonment. They're required to prove their innocence in the face of charges that are not made with any specificity, and it's provided that they are not entitled to know who made the accusations, when they were made, or what they consisted of. No counsel, as I say, no bill of particulars, and of course they could have their witnesses. Well, Mr. Okamura appeared at his hearing, which involved 2 judges, not 3, and he said, I want to have my hearing in San Francisco. That's where I conducted my business. And when they did this, they created a panel for each federal judicial district in the Northwest. So if they're, like Washington has 2 federal judicial districts, the Eastern and the Western, so they had a panel for each one. They had a panel for San Francisco, but he appears, and one of his judges is a former U.S. attorney from Montana, and he said, I want to have my hearing in San Francisco. Oh, don't worry about it. We'll treat it just as if you had the hearing and those witnesses were available. And so they proceed, and of course he is slam dunked into a conviction. Had he had the hearing, his grandson said, he would have had the opportunity to present evidence from his bankers. They had a farm and they had this business, who would have said, this is a loyal man beyond dispute. The fact of the matter is he spent most of his time during the war in prison. He ultimately was paroled to join his family, but the bank preserved the assets. And so they went back to the farm and they went back to the business, which is still in business today. Minyasui's father lost over $500,000 of property, 1942 value. They destroyed the Yasui family. Could it happen again? I don't think there's any question but that it could. The late Justice Scalia, 2 or 3 years ago, was asked that question, and he said, well, it shouldn't, but I'm not going to say it couldn't, because war, fear, and hysteria drive people to do things that you wouldn't expect that they would do, and that includes the judiciary. What the irony was not lost on me in 2016. We were in D.C. during November-December period, and Minyasui was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom. He has his own story. He defied the curfew. He was a U.S. citizen. He was the first Japanese graduate of the University of Oregon Law School. He was a commissioned officer in the ROTC, and they wouldn't let him serve. The federal judge took away his citizenship and gave him a year in solitary confinement. It went to the U.S. Supreme Court. They said, well, the actions were not inappropriate, and he's a U.S. citizen, but we don't think you can take away his citizenship, and we want a rehearing on the issue of his confinement. He'd already done 9 months of solitary confinement. There were 3 cases that went to the Supreme Court. They all fell in that same category. All of them in the 80s were revisited, and it was found that the government had grossly exaggerated many aspects of any potential reason to fear the Japanese. At the same time he's getting the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the Roanoke mayor is saying we should go back and have internment camps, because they worked really well and that's exactly what we need to have for our current situation. That, of course, drew a huge blasting response from the Washington Post, who referred back to the findings of the 1980 Commission that it was hysteria and racism and fear that drove what we did. No basis legally. None of these men were ever charged with a crime. No suggestion that there was ever a crime. But they paid dearly because they were the target. One other quick thing. There's a good book, Justice Denied by Peter Irons. If you want to follow the constitutional issues, Peter was very much involved in all these cases.
And the last thing I'd say, don't move, you and I are going to share this,
Okay.
is if you look at what's going on currently with the Trump administration, they're re-looking at the whole issue of immigration and who can come in and not. Be attuned to that relative to this topic, because this topic of how people get into this country and who's criminalized, as he's talked about, the Mexicans, or who should be allowed into the country, is still a current issue. So there is so many aspects of this topic yet to be looked at. If any of you are graduate students and want to do papers, there's so many topics in here that need more work, and I'm sure the museum would love to talk to you about taking those up.
Just for a second. So that's all the time we technically have. I'm going to close this now, but if you guys are willing to hang around for a few more minutes, we can take questions. We like to keep it on time. So I want to let everybody know that there are 2 more events in the series, and there are brochures at your seats and in the back. The first one is a tour of the internment camp. a guided tour on October 1st, Sunday, October 1st. There's a tour from 2 to 4 and another tour from 3 to 5. So to do that, you need to RSVP for that, because the courtroom that you saw in the video has a limit of 40 people. So we have 2 different tours and 80 people. We will be keeping a waiting list. So if go online to the League of Women Voter website, which is www.lwvmissoula.org. And you'll there find a link to an online reservation system called Who's In. And it's very easy to use, and you'll get a confirmation. If it says it's full at this, and for the video audience also, if it says it's full, go to the description there and you can send your name and contact information to us, because if people don't show by the time of the tour, we're going to let a waiting list in. We want to fill that room so people get the benefit of the speakers. So again, Bob will be part of that tour. Diane is not going to be able to make it. And a woman, Dr. Satsuki Ina, will be there, as well as Julie Kajun, and who am I forgetting? I'm so embarrassed. But anyway, so when we get there, it will be a 15-minute, a similar sequence, and seeing the buildings. In addition, on October 3rd, there's going to be a documentary called From a Silk Cocoon. That's an award-winning documentary that's an hour. It's going to be at the Roxy Theater, and followed by commentary from the filmmaker who's traveling here with that grant. We're able to bring her here, and she'll speak and take questions on the evening, 7 p.m. at the Roxy Theater. And that's open seating. You don't have to have tickets, but first come, first serve. Please do, before you leave, fill out an evaluation. That's for the purposes of our grant. They want to know how this is received. And the other thing is, in the back, if you want to be on a listserv for league events, and we'll share this with the Historical Museum too from this, to learn about future events, you can just leave your email on this and we'll let you know through email. So that's all. Thank you very much. Oh, one more thing. Jessie Rogers in the back is the current development director at the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. And she has copies of the book, Carol Van Valkenburg's 2009 book, and the 2015 DVD, as well as another booklet that shows the displays from the barracks and other places at the fort. So she has those for sale. If you have friends who weren't able to make it today and you think that they'd like to see this film, if you are part of the tour on Sunday, October 1st, you'll get information about coming 45 minutes before your tour to see this film again. So you'll get another opportunity. So thank you very much. If you have questions, please, is that your coffee? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Impacts of the propaganda related to this whole effort on the rest of the American citizens, and the only personal connection that I have to any of this that I personally knew was my own dad, who grew up in California. He was there during World War II, and his memory is it was so dangerous they had to round up those Japanese. And we were just talking about how trumped up the charges were, and they were just, absurd, as they are today for the Muslim community and for the Mexican community. If you could address the impact of that propaganda on citizens.
Well, I think you've made that point. I mean, this weekend is also the Historical Society looking at World War I, because this is the anniversary of World War I, and Montana's at the core of a similar issue around this, which is around the Sedition Act. The use of creating fear, in that case against Germans, including a lot of my relatives, that you could no longer, so they passed sedition acts and various laws in the Montana legislature and then nationally, that you couldn't have German newspapers anymore. You couldn't have people speaking that language. You couldn't have church services in that language. So that kind of fear-mongering has gone on in all of human history, I would say. I mean, it's nothing unique to the United States, but if you think you're immune to it, you're wrong, because I think what we see with Trump and the drumming up of fear about aliens, those people, Mexicans in particular, but other groups, is still very prominent and in fact is being fed. Very much fed, and against African Americans as well, certainly in this country right now. And the museum's had a great exhibit of World War II propaganda posters, which if you haven't seen, you can go online and look at a lot of them. We had one of the largest collections in the United States of World War II propaganda posters. Those came out not before the war, but after the war started, of course, you know, with racist stereotypes of both Germans and Japanese and Italians. So, and they were used everywhere to encourage people to participate in war activities, whether it was buying war bonds or whatever. If you don't buy this war bond, your son is going to die at the hands of whomever because you didn't do your part. So, I mean, it's used as a tool to get people to participate in war activities and to stifle dissent, because the other side of it is they're doing that to promote that, but as you could talk about, they use various legal means to make sure that dissent doesn't happen in times of war or crisis.
Yes. I'm told that Japanese families do not buy Dr. Seuss books for their children, and there's a damn good reason why they don't. Go back and look online and see what his involvement was in creating many of these caricatures that are absolutely intolerable, and he did that for a period of time and very effectively. I think I was born in 1945. My dad was a Navy pilot in the Mediterranean. My wife's dad was a Marine in the Pacific. You know, I think you have to, and we had some friends, a friend that was visiting a couple of years ago, and I was talking about this topic, and she's about 7 years older than I am and grew up as a child in New York, and she said, but Bob, you don't understand the hysteria that we faced. We were deathly afraid. And I ended up later in my career representing a Japanese company that bought a big ranch in Montana. And my dad said, well, I guess somebody has to represent them. Ellen's dad said when he learned I was doing this, bear in mind that national security always trumps rights. And so I think the men and women that were involved in the war and the children that experienced that have perhaps a very different view than we're capable of having, because there was, the commission in 1980 said it was all hysteria, racism, and fear. It wasn't anything legitimate to be concerned about, but those voices were few and far between.
Well, I think the other part of that, too, is that some of you are probably starting to watch the Ken Burns thing on Vietnam. And the fact of the matter is, if you're going to train the military to kill people, you've got to dehumanize them in order to be able to do that. Your opponents become stereotypes. They're not human beings. They are a stereotype. So that is a factor of war. And so while you may think the Japanese over there are different, the Japanese living next door to you suddenly become very suspicious. Other questions? Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if you could comment on the differential treatment of American citizens of German and Italian ancestry on the one hand with those of Japanese at this time. Was this simply racism, or was there any logic from a security point of view in treating them?
I'm not sure I can speak to all of that, but as I think we pointed out in the film, and I can talk about the Italians, most Missoulians knew about Italians out of Fort Missoula and have continued to have warm feelings. There was never that level of hostility toward them. I think because of the race issue, they're Italian, they're Catholics. The Catholic Church in Montana is deeply involved with them and being present to meet their needs to communicate at home and all those sorts of issues. Whereas when the war starts, the sheriff here goes out and actually takes into protective custody 6 Japanese who were working on the railroad because they think someone's going to probably hang them. So there was an intense, immediate reaction to the Japanese that was extraordinarily different than the reaction to the Europeans, even though the European War had been going on. Americans certainly knew a lot about it, but they never associated that in that kind of intense concern about their Italian or German relatives who lived in Montana or their neighbors. Never did that. And I really think you have to lay that simply to racism.
Yeah, I agree. It was largely a question of they look different and they're identifiable, except that created some problems for Koreans and Chinese because they would get occasionally snapped up too. And there was also a tremendous propaganda effort directed at the Japanese in terms of their potential for espionage, treason, and that all came to light in the 80s when there was consideration by federal appellate courts of the convictions of Korematsu, Minyasui, and Hirabayashi. There were 3 separate cases. These men have all received, by the way, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. They all defied the orders as U.S. citizens and paid for it. But during that process, they were able to establish that the defense side of the law, the people that work for the Army, knowingly misled the United States position in the Supreme Court. In fact, the acting Solicitor General for the United States issued a formal apology for the actions that had been taken to misrepresent to the court the fact of the matter. And the facts that they presented painted a picture of wholesale concern, legitimate concern about acts of espionage and what have you, when in fact that didn't exist at all. So the government itself, on the defense side, the Justice Department really took a much different and measured view of this, but the guys that work for the Army bit the bullet and said, you know, we're going to put these people where they belong. And the generals controlled the actions that were taken, and it wasn't pleasant.
One thing that didn't come up, most of you probably don't know, is that the government also really did consider interning Americans who were of Italian and German descent. But since so many of them were in Congress and other places like that and prominent, and the impracticality, they didn't do it. They did the Japanese because you can identify them, and they're so much more other than white Americans. But it was considered. And there were internment camps for prominent Italians, et cetera, who were in the United States under different various visa statuses and governmental. They're mostly on the East Coast.
They did get a few, and the classic example that I ran across is Enzio Pizza, the bassist for the Metropolitan Opera. He was on the verge of getting U.S. citizenship. He was married to a U.S. citizen, had a daughter. He was arrested. He had a hearing. It was voted 2-1 that he be released, but the one no vote made him a dangerous enemy alien. And fortunately for him, his father-in-law was a dentist who had Fiorello LaGuardia as one of his patients. So they went to Fiorello LaGuardia, and they actually got an appeal of the decision to the U.S. attorney. But they had the problem that all of these fellows had. They had to reconstruct as best they could what the charges were based on what he could tell them. There was nothing that indicated what he was charged with. The fact of the matter was, it was all an effort on the part of a fellow bassist who envied the position that he had, and he created and fabricated the evidence that they relied on that damn near put him in prison too.
Well, and another part of that, when you talked about people being able to submit testimony in writing, if you look at any of these files that are now preserved in the National Archives, and we have some of them, of course, and a lot of them are online with Densho out of Seattle as well, is letters were submitted, like for Yasui. He was head of the Rotary, and he was a Methodist and the Orchardist, and so there would be letters submitted on his behalf. But in the end, many neighbors of Japanese did take advantage of this economically, and so it was in their interest to sort of keep these men from being able to reclaim their assets. You have to give credit to some groups, like the Quakers, went in often and tried to protect the assets for various of these folks. I mean, think you're the poor wife at home. Japanese culture, the man is in charge of everything. She doesn't know anything about this. She has to pay the taxes. The assets are all frozen. They start losing their property 10 cents on the dollar, seized for taxes, etc. I mean, that part of it is also just a hell that isn't really reflected when we're just talking about the men who were interned at this kind of a camp. So tax law comes into this too.
Okay, maybe just one more question.
Yep.
If there's a pressing need for clarification or something that's gnawing at you.
Again, lots of topics for further research. The museum would be delighted. I'm sure if any of you want to get into the Catholic issue, was over at the diocese. They've got several hundred documents relate to this. And from their point of view, it's an important issue in conjunction with the United States for the protection of Americans who were held in Italy. But thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We're out of here.